The chamber was silent, the way only space could make things silent. Completely. Finally. Without apology, 712 delegates sat inside the grand dome of Vareth Station, a floating structure the size of a small moon, built at the exact gravitational center of the known galaxy. It had taken the Galactic Council 4,000 years to construct it, and another 2,000 to agree on where to put the chairs. Every species with more than 1 billion members had a seat. Every species with a fleet had 2. The Dravati, who had tentacles instead of arms, and communicated through color shifts in their skin, glowed a deep satisfied violet as the vote was read aloud. Motion 7714 Epsilon, the council speaker announced, his translator implant turning his clicks and hisses into something everyone could understand. The formal removal of humanity from the Galactic Registry of Recognized Species. The vote stands at 691 in favor, 21 abstained, 0 opposed. 0 opposed. Not even one voice had pushed back. The chamber erupted in noise, not celebration exactly. More like the kind of relief a room feels when something everyone had been worrying about for a long time is finally dealt with. Delegates embraced each other in whatever way their biology allowed. The Dravati glowed brighter. The tall, bone-white Velthuri clicked their mandibles together in approval. The squat, heavily armored Gorand simply nodded once, which for them was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Nobody mentioned that the humans had been missing for 11 years. That was the polite way of putting it. The impolite way, the way it was discussed in back corridors and private channels, was that humanity had simply stopped. No signals, no ships, no colony transmissions, no distress calls, nothing. 11 years ago, every single human presence in the galaxy had gone dark in the span of about 6 days. 7 billion people on Earth, 400 million on Mars, hundreds of smaller colonies scattered across 32 star systems, gone, like a light switched off. The Council had spent 4 years investigating. They found scorched atmosphere at several colony sites, some debris that didn't match any known weapon signature, and exactly one data fragment recovered from a destroyed satellite near Proxima Centauri that showed 14 seconds of blurred visual feed before cutting out. In those 14 seconds, you could see what might have been a human figure, and what was definitely something else, something large and fast and wrong in a way that made even the Velthuri, who had seen 3 extinction events up close, request the footage be sealed. After the investigation, the Council voted to classify humanity as extinct cause undetermined. After that, they voted to remove humanity's seat from the chamber. After that, they quietly redistricted human space and began allowing member species to file resource claims on formerly human star systems. The Gorand filed first. They always filed first. That had all been very orderly, very civilized. The kind of thing the Galactic Council was genuinely good at managing tragedy with procedure, turning grief into policy, moving on. And then, 11 years and 4 months after humanity went dark, a signal appeared. It came from deep inside what had been designated as the abandoned human zone, a region of space nobody went into anymore, not because it was forbidden, but because it made people uncomfortable. The signal was low frequency, old-fashioned even by human standards, the kind of transmission format humanity had used in its early spacefaring days, almost nostalgic in its simplicity. It said, "This is Colonel Adai's Okoi, Earth Defense Remnant, broadcasting on all frequencies. If anyone is listening, we are alive. We are returning. Please do not shoot at us. We have had a very difficult 11 years, and we would appreciate some patience." The council chamber didn't hear it first. A Dravati cargo hauler named Sithvel Orath heard it first. Because Sithvel Orith was exactly the kind of stubborn, profit-chasing freighter captain who ignored travel advisories and cut through the abandoned human zone because it saved 3 days of transit time. When the signal hit his receivers, he almost spilled his nutrient paste. He sat there listening to it repeat 6 times before he remembered he was supposed to do something. He reported it. He almost didn't, because he wasn't supposed to be where he was. But something about the voice, calm, tired, completely certain, made him feel like if he didn't report it, something important would be lost. The council's response was immediate and somewhat embarrassing in hindsight. They assumed it was a recording. Then they assumed it was a censor ghost. Then they assumed it was some kind of elaborate hoax being played by the Quetzari, who were known for that sort of thing. It took 48 hours, 6 separate verification teams, and one very frustrated communications officer named Delegate Prius of the Velthari, who had personally pushed hardest for the Extinction Declaration, to confirm that the signal was live, was human, and was coming from approximately 14 vessels moving at combat speed toward the inner systems. 14 ships. That was all dot when the Velthari first entered the galactic community. They had arrived with a fleet of 9,000 warships, and still felt they were coming in humble. 14 ships was not a fleet. 14 ships was barely a convoy. The Council's military advisors looked at the scans and said, politely, that there was nothing to worry about. They were using the old definition of worry. The first scan of the lead vessel made the scan operator ask his equipment to check itself 3 times. The ship was human-built. The basic architecture was recognizable. The hull plating style was consistent with pre-disappearance human military design. But it had grown. That was the only word that seemed to fit. It had grown the way a tree grows around a fence, incorporating things, adapting, expanding in directions that shouldn't have been structurally possible. There were sections of the hull that seemed to absorb scanner signals instead of reflecting them. There were drive signatures that matched no known propulsion system. There was something at the front of the ship that the scan operator logged as unknown feature. Possible weapon. Recommend not pointing anything at it. The other 13 ships were similar. Different sizes, different stages of this strange growth. But all of them carrying that same sense of something familiar that had gone somewhere. Unfamiliar and come back changed. The Council called an emergency session. This was notable because the Council had not called an emergency session in 200 years. Not for the Goron border crisis. Not for the Velthari succession wars. Not even for the time an entire star system had unexpectedly gone supernova 2 centuries ahead of schedule. Emergency sessions meant the Council was scared. And the Council was very rarely scared. Colonel Okoy's fleet did not slow down. They did not respond to hails. Not because they were ignoring them. They responded to every single one, promptly and politely, but because they didn't stop moving while they responded. They were heading somewhere specific, and they were not going to be delayed. When a Council patrol vessel positioned itself across their path in what was meant to be an unambiguous blocking maneuver, the lead human ship sent back a transmission so straightforward it made the patrol captain feel slightly embarrassed. "We see you," Okoy's voice said. "We are not stopping. We are not hostile. But we are not stopping. We have somewhere we need to be, and then we will explain everything. Please move. We would hate for there to be a misunderstanding after everything we have survived." The patrol captain moved. Later, when asked why, he said he couldn't fully explain it. The ship hadn't done anything threatening. Okoy's voice had been polite. But there had been something in the way those 14 ships moved, a kind of absolute, bone-deep confidence, the movement of things that had already decided that nothing in this galaxy was going to stop them. That made stepping aside feel like the most sensible thing he had ever done. The Council watched the fleet's trajectory and realized, with a cold dropping feeling in several of their species' equivalent of stomachs, where the humans were going. They were heading for Earth, and something was already there, waiting. The thing waiting near Earth did not have a name in any language. The Galactic Council recognized that it had been there for 11 years, sitting at the edge of humanity's home system like a stone dropped into still water, perfectly motionless, perfectly patient. The Council had detected it 8 years ago during a routine, long-range mapping survey and had immediately classified the discovery, debated what to do about it for 3 years, and ultimately decided to do nothing. This was not cowardice, or at least, that was what the Council told itself. It was practicality. The object was not moving. It was not transmitting. It was not doing anything except existing in a way that made every piece of scanning equipment in range behave strangely. The Veil-Theory had sent one probe. The probe had stopped functioning 17 light minutes from the object, not destroyed, just stopped, as if someone had reached into it and politely turned it off. They did not send a second probe. The Gorond had filed a motion to classify the object as a natural phenomenon and move on. The motion had passed, mostly because the alternative, acknowledging that something had come to humanity's home system and was simply sitting there, and that nobody knew what it was or what it wanted, was a thought that made everyone deeply uncomfortable. The Council watched the 14 human ships cross into the Sol system with the helpless, frozen feeling of people watching something happen that they had no power to affect and perhaps no right to interfere with. They had observation drones positioned at safe distances, very safe distances, and those drones fed live footage back to the emergency session, where 712 delegates sat watching in silence. The human fleet did not slow down when it entered the system. If anything, it accelerated slightly, the way you might walk faster when you finally see your front door after a very long journey. The object near Earth noticed. That was the only way to describe it. The Council's instruments detected a change in the electromagnetic signature of the object at the exact moment the human ships crossed the system boundary, like a shift in attention, like something that had been waiting a long time finally looking. What happened next took 11 minutes. The Council's drones recorded every second of it, and the footage was subsequently watched by every diplomat, military advisor, xenobiologist, physicist, and intelligence officer in the known galaxy approximately 600 times before anyone felt they understood even a fraction of it. The 14 human ships arranged themselves in a specific formation, not a combat formation, not anything the Council's military analysts recognized. It looked almost like a shape with meaning, like a word written in ship positions across space. The lead vessel, Okoi's ship, moved to the front and stayed there, and then the whole formation went still. Then Okoi spoke. Not on any frequency the Council was monitoring. The drones only caught it because they were recording everything in the full spectrum. She spoke in something that wasn't quite language, or rather wasn't any language that had existed before 11 years ago. It had patterns. It had rhythm. It carried something that the Council's xenolinguists later described as emotional weight, so dense it was almost physical, which was not a scientific measurement, but was the only way they could think. To put it, the thing near Earth responded. The response lasted 47 seconds. It registered across 17 different instrument types simultaneously. 3 of the Council's drones simply shut down from the data load. The ones that survived showed the object shifting, not moving in space. Exactly, more like adjusting the way a living thing adjusts. A settling, a rearrangement of presence. And then, slowly, it began to leave. The Council watched it go. It took 4 minutes to clear the solar system, and then it was simply gone, not in any direction that made geometric sense. Gone the way things go when they don't belong in normal space. One of the Vel-3 delegates made a sound that her translator could not convert into any other language, and nobody asked her to explain it. The 14 ships moved to Earth orbit. They hung there for a moment, all of them, and then Okoye's voice came through on a standard council frequency, calm and clear, as if she was reporting a routine docking maneuver. "Sol system is secure," she said. "We are ready to speak with the council. We are ready to explain. We would ask that the resource claim filings on human space be suspended pending that conversation, and we would ask that our seat in the chamber be returned. We are not making a threat. We are simply noting that it would be very awkward for everyone if we came all this way and had to sit in the hallway." The council session devolved into chaos for approximately 20 minutes. When order was restored, the speaker asked for a preliminary account of where humanity had been and what had happened. For context, before the formal hearing could be scheduled, there was a long pause. Then Okoye's voice came back, and this time it was not entirely alone. There were other voices layered behind it. Dozens of them, quiet and harmonic, in a way that made several delegates reach for their translation devices, only to find the devices were already working fine, and what they were hearing simply was not a language. "We did not disappear," Okoye said. "We were taken. What took us was old, older than this council, older than most of the species in that chamber. It came because it was curious. It had been watching us for a long time and decided it wanted to know what we were. It thought the most efficient way to know what we were was to keep us, to study us, to put us somewhere it could observe us without interference." Another pause. It did not expect us to adapt. She let that sit in the silence for a moment. And the silence was the kind that fills up a room like water, the kind everyone in it can feel pressing against their ears. The 11 years of absence suddenly looked different. Not a tragedy, not an extinction, an education, or something that had started as captivity and become, through sheer stubborn human insistence on surviving and understanding and pushing back against any environment that tried to contain them. Something else entirely. The council's xenobiologists were already requesting access to the crew manifest. The preliminary scan data from the ships had shown biological signatures that matched human, baseline genetics, but with variations that had no evolutionary precedent. Not mutations exactly, nothing random, nothing damaging. More like someone had taken the original design and added to it deliberately, precisely, in ways that suggested deep knowledge of how the design worked out, except the entity that had taken them had not been the one doing the adding. That was what the biologists kept coming back to, reading and rereading the data. The changes were human-directed. The humans had looked at what was being done to their environment, their biology, their understanding, and they had taken it apart and put it back together in a way that worked better for them. They had not been shaped by their captivity. They had shaped themselves using it. The Gorond representative, whose people had filed the first and largest resource claim on human space, quietly asked an aide to begin the paperwork for withdrawing that claim. He did not explain why. He did not need to. Meanwhile, in the chamber, a younger delegate from a species called the Mirith, small mammalian, only recently added to the council, raised her hand and asked the question everyone else was carefully not asking. When the entity left, she said, her voice very careful and precise, "Did it leave because you convinced it to? Did it leave because you scared it? Or did it leave because," she paused, "because it lost?" The pause from Okoye's end of the communication was exactly 3 seconds long. "Yes," she said. Nobody asked which option she meant. Nobody was sure they wanted to know. The chamber stayed very quiet, and outside the dome's viewports, the stars looked exactly the same as they always had, which was somehow the most unsettling part of everything. The council speaker cleared his throat and called for a recess. In the hallway, 691 delegates who had voted to declare humanity extinct stood in small groups and said very little. And what little they said was careful. And what they were all thinking, though none of them put it into words, was a simple, enormous, restructuring thought. Humanity was not what it had been, and the galaxy had just agreed, unanimously, to figure out what that meant. The formal hearing was scheduled for 3 days after Okoy's fleet entered Earth orbit. In those 3 days, the Galactic Council did more frantic behind-closed-doors work than it had done in the previous 2 centuries combined. Intelligence agencies were activated across 17 member species. Every scrap of data collected from the abandoned human zone over the past 11 years was pulled, reanalyzed, and reclassified. The 14-second footage fragment from the Proxima Centauri satellite, the one that had been sealed, was unsealed, watched by every senior delegate personally, and then very quickly resealed again, though now for different reasons than before. Before, it had been sealed because it was disturbing. Now it was sealed because the figure in those 14 seconds, the human figure that everyone had assumed was panicked, was running, was a victim, was standing completely still, and the look on its face was not fear. The Valkyrie delegate Prias, who had argued most forcefully for the Extinction Declaration and whose people had been the most enthusiastic about redistricting human space, spent all 3 days in her private quarters. Her aides reported she was not sleeping. They did not report what she was doing instead, but 3 aides quit in those 3 days, which was unusual even for Valkyrie service, whose working conditions were notoriously demanding. On the 3rd day, the council chamber filled to capacity. There were faces present that had never attended a formal hearing before. Senior military figures, deep space explorers, researchers in fields ranging from xenobiology to theoretical physics. Species that had observership status rather than full membership and sent representatives to sit in the gallery. The chamber had not been this full since the day it was inaugurated. Colonel Adaze Okoy walked in alone. This was unexpected. The council had prepared for a delegation, advisors, aides, military escorts. 14 ships implied hundreds of crew members. Nobody had imagined the representative of returning humanity would simply walk through the main entrance by herself, in a uniform that was recognizably military in origin, but had been modified in ways that made it look like something else, something that had outgrown its original category, and sit down at what had been, until motion 7714 Epsilon, humanity's permanent seat. She was not what the council had expected her to look like. Not that anyone had been entirely sure what to expect. 11 years changes people, and what she had described happening during those 11 years went far beyond ordinary change. She looked approximately the age her service record said she was, late 40s, and she moved with a kind of economy that athletes and soldiers and people who have learned exactly how much energy every action costs tend to move with. Her eyes were the most noticeable thing. Not the color, the quality. The way she looked at things, at the chamber, at the delegates, at the gallery, was the way a person looks when they are reading multiple things simultaneously and finding all of them interesting. She sat. She placed her hands flat on the table. She waited. The speaker welcomed her back, carefully, using the formal language reserved for returning dignitaries. He noted the irregularity of her appearance without an official delegation. He asked, politely, where the rest of humanity's representation was. "They're available," Okoy said. "Most of them are on Earth right now." "Some of them are." She paused, and for the first time something flickered across her face that wasn't calm. Something briefly complicated. "Some of them exist in a form that makes physical attendance in this chamber logistically difficult. We'll address that separately." The chamber absorbed this information in silence. She then did something no delegate in the memoirs. Council's history had ever done at the opening of a formal hearing. She apologized. "I want to say first," she said, her voice carrying easily through the chamber without being raised, "that we understand what our disappearance did to this body. We understand the uncertainty. We understand that declaring us extinct was a reasonable administrative decision, given the evidence available. We do not hold it against the Council." A very brief pause. "We do, however, need to discuss the resource claim filings, and we need to have that discussion before we address anything else. Not as a threat, as a practical matter. 3 colonies were partially dismantled in the past 2 years. We will need assistance restoring them. The species that filed claims will need to be involved in that restoration. This is not negotiable." The Goran representative, who had thought he had quietly withdrawn his claim before the hearing, discovered that Okoye already knew he hadn't fully completed the paperwork. She looked directly at him when she said the word restoration, and he had the uncomfortable experience of feeling like he had been not quite caught at something and was being given one precise, professional opportunity to correct it. He completed the paperwork during the recess. The formal account of what had happened came after. Okoye gave it in the methodical, factual way of someone who had organized chaotic experience into orderly narrative many times over. Someone who had been telling pieces of this story for years already and knew exactly how to structure it. For maximum clarity, the entity, she declined to name it, for reasons she said she would explain, had taken humanity in the span of 6 days. Not violently. That was the part that had confused the investigation teams who found the scorched colony sites. The scorching was not attack damage. It was the residue of a transit method that humanity had had no framework to understand or prepare for. People, ships, infrastructure, all of it had simply been relocated. 11 years ago, across 6 days, every human being in the galaxy had been moved. They had been put somewhere. That was not a place in the way the galaxy understood places. The entity's domain, its environment, a space that operated on rules that were related to the galaxy's physics, the way a summary is related to a book, recognizable in outline, compressed, translated, missing things. "We called it the margin," Okoye said, "because it was like being written in the margins of reality, existing alongside the main text, but not quite in it. For the first 6 months," she said, "humanity had simply tried to survive. They had resources. The entity had provided what it understood to be the necessities of human life, based on its observations, which had been thorough but not quite complete. It understood human biology. It understood human social structure in a broad sense. What it had not fully accounted for was what humans did when they had a problem they didn't understand. They took it apart. We had nothing else to do," Okoye said, and something in her voice made several delegates, who had been maintaining expressions of diplomatic neutrality, briefly abandon the effort. 7 billion people, removed from their lives, existing in an impossible place, being studied by something we couldn't see directly and couldn't communicate with. We could have panicked. Some of us did for a while. But panic is a temporary state. After panic comes assessment. After assessment comes planning. After planning comes work. Humanity had spent 11 years working. They had worked on understanding the margin, its physics, its geometry, its rules. They had worked on understanding the entity, not by trying to communicate with it. Not at first, but by watching how it responded to them, mapping its behavior the way naturalists map animal behavior, building a model of it through observation and careful experiment. They had worked on themselves, their technology, their biology, their understanding of what a human being could be and become if the old constraints of evolutionary history were replaced with deliberate, informed, cooperative choice. By year 3, they had managed the first successful two-way signal to the entity. By year 6, they had convinced it to let certain individuals study the process it used to maintain the margin. Not copy it, understand it. The entity had found this amusing, or the closest thing to amusement its cognition produced. It had expected study subjects. It had instead produced, over 6 years of observation, the beginning of a peer relationship with something it had considered categorically inferior. By year 9. Humans were proposing modifications to the margin structure that the entity had not considered. Some of them worked. By year 11, the entity had made a decision. It let us go, Okoi said. That's the simplest way to say it. It decided we were no longer interesting to study because we had become something it needed to think about rather than observe. Those are different things. Study subjects stay contained. Peers do not. She looked around the chamber. It also told us, in the communication that preceded our departure, that there were others like it. That this galaxy, what we call the galaxy, what this council administers, is one of many such spaces. That there are things older than the council, older than any civilization in this room, that move between those spaces the way you or I might walk between rooms. It told us that, historically, those things have not considered anything in this galaxy worth extended attention. She paused. It said we were the first exception it was aware of. The chamber was absolutely silent, outside the dome. The galaxy went on turning, enormous and ancient and full of spaces between its lights that no one had yet thought to look into carefully. Okoi sat with her hands flat on the table and let the silence do the work that words couldn't. And every delegate in that room felt, with different organs and different nervous systems, but the same essential sensation, the floor of there. The restoration of humanity's official status took 11 days of procedural work, which was, by the Council's standards, extraordinarily fast. Motion 7714 Epsilon was formally reversed. Humanity's seat was reinstated. The resource claim filings were suspended, then canceled in an order that corresponded roughly to how quickly each species could calculate the political math of having filed a claim against a people who had just returned from 11 years of surviving, something ancient and vast, and who had come back different. The Goran finished their paperwork in under an hour. The Veltheri took 9 days but finished with a formal apology attached, which was without precedent in their diplomatic history. Okoi accepted every apology in the same way, with a nod, a direct look, and no comment that could be taken as either full forgiveness or ongoing grievance. She was very good at leaving things exactly as complicated as they were. The 3 damaged colonies were a harder problem. 2 of them had been partially stripped for materials, not destroyed. The species who filed claims had followed the Council's environmental protection protocols, which said a great deal about how confident everyone had been that the humans were actually gone. Restoration would take time and resources, and a level of cooperation between species that the Council was accustomed to mandating, but not accustomed to actually achieving. Okoi was patient about this. She was patient about most things. The people who had come back with her, the crew of those 14 ships, the survivors who had spent 11 years in a place with different rules, they were all patient in that particular way. The way of people who had long since stopped defining time by its inconvenience. What occupied the Council far more than the administrative repairs was the question of what humanity had actually brought back, not as a security concern, not initially, as a scientific one, an existential one, the kind of question that reorganizes every question that comes after it. What were the changes? How extensive were they? What did it mean for humanity's role in the galactic community? What did it mean for everyone else? Okoi submitted to every examination the Council's researchers requested. So did the rest of the crew, all 119 of them, with a cooperative willingness that the researchers found almost unnerving. They were used to species being territorial about biology, guarded about information, slow to trust. The humans offered everything. Ask what you want, look at what you need to look at. Here are our notes from the past 11 years. Here are 11 years of research on what we are and what we became. We organized it by subject for your convenience. The researchers were organized by subject for the next 4 years. The biological findings came first because they were most visible. The changes were real and they were profound, but they were not random. Human baseline was intact. Genetics, basic physiology, evolutionary architecture, all of it present and functional. What had been added was layered on top, integrated through methods that the xenobiologists could observe and document, but not, for some time, fully explain. Sensory extensions that allowed processing of information outside human standard range. Neurological modifications that allowed simultaneous processing at speeds that should have required fundamentally different brain architecture. Cellular repair mechanisms that operated on principles that were consistent with known biology, but pushed far past its usual limits. The entity had not done this. Okoye had been precise about that, and the data confirmed it. What the entity had done was expose humanity to an environment where these changes were possible, where the raw material existed, where understanding was achievable if you worked for it. The humans had done the work. 11 years of careful, cooperative, thoroughly documented self-modification, carried out with the deliberate precision of people who understood exactly what they were doing and were determined to do it right. We lost people, Okoye said. In a smaller meeting, a scientific debrief rather than a formal council session. She said it without drama, with the directness of someone who had carried that fact for a long time and had found a way to carry it that didn't break anything. 47 people in the first year, mostly from things we didn't understand yet. 12 more over the next 4 years from experiments that didn't work the way we hoped. We have their names. We will always have their names. She paused. But we were not going to stop. That was decided very early. Whatever it costs, we were going to learn everything this place could teach us. Because the alternative was waiting in the dark until something else decided what happened to us. And we had all decided, together, that we were done with that. The thing that occupied the council longest, more than the biology, more than the technology, more than the 11 ships' worth of research documentation, was what Okoye had said about the spaces between spaces, the old things that moved through them. The fact that humanity was the first exception anyone was aware of, not the first species to encounter them. There were hints in the Council's own history, classified reports, sealed incident files, a pattern that became visible only when you were looking for it, that suggested other species had brushed against these things before. Never this directly. Never with this outcome. The difference, the researchers eventually concluded, not with certainty, but with the careful qualified certainty that was the best science could do, was the thing Okoye kept coming back to in every conversation, in every debrief, in every formal and informal discussion of what had happened. Humans had not tried to escape. Not after the first few months. They had tried to understand. There's a difference, Okoye explained to a gathering of the Council's youngest delegates, a session that had been organized partly as political symbolism and partly because someone had realized that the people who were going to be running this galaxy in 50 years needed to hear this directly from the source. Running is a response to a threat. Learning is a response to a puzzle. We decided, very early, that the thing that had us was a puzzle, not a threat. Not because it wasn't dangerous. It was. It absolutely was. But because calling it a threat was a dead end. There was nothing at the end of that road except fear. Calling it a puzzle meant there was something at the end of that road. An answer, maybe a solution. At minimum, an understanding. And understanding was enough? One of the young delegates asked, Okoi thought about it for a moment, genuinely, not performing consideration, but actually thinking. Understanding changed what we were capable of, she said, which changed what the entity was dealing with, which changed what it decided to do with us. So yes, understanding was enough. Understanding was everything. The galaxy's relationship with humanity did not change overnight. It changed the way things change when something fundamental has shifted, slowly in the official channels, quickly in the informal ones. Species that had been considering humanity a historical footnote began quietly establishing new trade contacts. Research institutions that had been staffed entirely by non-human scientists began accepting applications from human researchers with the kind of urgency that suggested they understood they were behind. Military alliances were renegotiated with a new kind of care, the kind that comes from genuinely reassessing what an ally might be worth. Okoi remained as Earth's primary council delegate for 7 years. She was an effective diplomat, not because she was warm or easy, or particularly interested in performing any of the soft qualities that diplomatic traditions usually rewarded, but because she was exactly as honest as she appeared to be, and in a body built on 10,000 years of careful political navigation. Absolute honesty functioned like something entirely unexpected. On the day she stepped back from the formal role, passing it to a younger member of the 14 ship crew, a man named Torres, who had spent 3 of his 11 years in the margin doing nothing but studying the entities, communication patterns, and had come back able to perceive things in conversations that other people were not aware they were communicating. She gave a short address to the he chamber that nobody had asked for, and everyone remembered. Afterward, "This council declared us gone," she said. "You were wrong, but you were not unreasonable. We understand that. What we ask, going forward, is not forgiveness for the error. What we ask is this: when something disappears, and you cannot explain why, and the explanation you have doesn't feel complete, sit with the incompleteness for a while. Don't rush to close the file. The galaxy is older than this chamber, and bigger than our maps of it, and the things in the spaces between what we know are not all threats. Some of them are just puzzles nobody has been strange enough to solve yet." She looked around the chamber one last time. "We are very strange," she said, with something that might have been pride and might have been humor and was probably both. "We have decided to lean into it." She left. The chamber sat with the words for a moment. 712 delegates of 712 species, each of them processing in the particular way their biology and history had given them. Outside the dome, the galaxy turned. In its outer reaches, in the deep unmapped distances beyond the council's farthest station, something very old and very patient moved between spaces that had no names, going where the interesting things were. And somewhere in the shape of its movement, in the direction it was heading, in the qualit,